Fear, Ricoeurs argues, has a determinate objective in contrast to the object of anguish, which is contrastingly indeterminate. Furthermore, anguish threatens, not just a part of me as may be the case with fear, but the self in its totality. The threat in this context is to the freedom of the self. Wittgenstein, in his work Philosophical Investigations, distinguishes between the cause and object of fear, and he appears here to conceive of cause in terms of a causal stimulus that prompts a response from the sympathetic nervous system. The cause is linked to an effect by the observational knowledge we have of their relation, whereas actions precipitated by anguish appear to be connected to reasons that we possess non-observational knowledge about. Anguish is a phenomenon that occurs at various levels, including at the vital level of life and death. Ricoeurs argues that death is not implied by life but is rather related to some external cause which threatens, a cause which I witness empirically, observationally, in the death of others who are permanently absent from our common life arenas. Ricoeurs argues, somewhat mysteriously, that the form of knowledge we are concerned with in this case is abstract, presumably because reasoning is involved. All men die, therefore I too, page 289. The death of an acquaintance, friend, or family member is, he claims, internalized. I then anticipate my own absence in all my life arenas in a non-intellectual, non-cognitive spirit of anguish. A Freudian analysis of the movement from the fear of my own death to the knowledge that I too must die involves the mechanism of sublimation, which in turn is related to a substitute form of satisfaction that removes the anxiety or anguish from the resulting act of judgment. This process is no easy transition for the agent concerned, as psychoanalytical therapy clearly demonstrates. The more natural mechanism psychoanalytical patients engage in is that of the repression of the awareness of one's own mortality. Heidegger characterized this phenomenon as fleeing away from the fate of one's death. Such repression or fleeing prevents more authentic relations to one's death, such as that which we encounter in the Socratic sublimation of death into something good, something free from anxiety and anguish but at the same time intimately connected to the holistic worth and dignity of man. In the case of Socrates, the fact that he was, as the Bible put the matter, full of years, 80 years and 10, obviously contributed to the acceptance of his own unjust fate. Existentialism and phenomenology, in their different, but related ways, question this classical account, and in the case of the former we are invited to characterize our relation to our deaths in terms of an ambiguity connected to the fundamental contingency of having been born. Such ambiguity incorporates the non-necessity of having once been born, thus the anguish of death, the primal anguish that eats away at my being in the world is not completely imminent to my existence. When death is here, you are no longer. When you are here, it hasn't yet arrived. Page 290. Apparently my totality as a whole is threatened by anguish which is then transcended by reasons for living, which are also reasons for dying. Page 291. This reasoning is Hegelian, an exercise in dialogical logic in which consciousness is both contingent, fragile, and associated with the notion of negation, which Ricoeurs characterizes as the nothingness of freedom. This idea of freedom is anguished over abandonment, and also possessed of a will to live that manifests itself in an upsurge of projects directed at a future that could make history. The will, so far as Kant is concerned, expresses itself in maxims for action which can both be the source of good and evil. For Kant, but not for Ricoeurs, hope is the organizing idea for lives thrown into an arena where the choices of others and indeed one's own choices can bring misfortune upon oneself and others. Ricoeurs embraces a notion of dialectical hope, which does not surmount this chaos or reconcile one stoically to the misfortunes of life, but rather is offered as a consolation, being as it is associated with anguish, until the last day. Page 304. The question of negation and the finitude of my being, which evidences itself in one's perceptual relation to the world and one's moods, are taken up in the final essay of this work, Negativity and Primary Affirmation. This finitude has powers that are expressed in potentialities in the form of I can, and these powers, Ricoeurs argues, can be summarized in terms of the concept of character. This idea is linked to the tragedies of want and suffering, and can become the subject of an account in which these wants and sufferings can be evaluated by a character taking up a position, making a stand on the ground of his powers. Yet it is not a Greek analysis of character or the human sush we will encounter in these reflections, but rather a phenomenological excursion into the realm of meaning in which negation and negativity appear to find a natural home. Kant is evoked in this reflection on the nature of value, which, it is argued, implies the absence of what is valued. What is not acknowledged, however, is the role that reason and understanding plays in the Kantian account. Rather, the emphasis is placed on the Hegelian idea of recognition, of the perspective and value of the other. On this account, discourse has a negative structure in which the dread of death is embedded, and the question arises over a differentiation between what is objective and what can be described in existential and phenomenological analyses. The conclusion of this reflection on meaning, point of view, and the will to live is that the negativity referred to above is not an immediate negation, but rather a negation of negation. Page 318. Sartre is invoked in the context of this discussion, and a reference is made to an analysis of imagination in which it is claimed, the imagination which annihilates the whole of the real for the benefit of absence and the unreal. Freedom, on the Sartrean account, is not conceived of in Kantian terms, where freedom is characterized in terms of the power of a being to act to bring about what is real. Sartre's account appeals rather to a notion of nothingness that is discontinuous with the ontological comprehension of being. Ricoeurs appeals here to Anaximander who, it is claimed, maintained that being has a dialectical structure and linked to what Ricoeurs terms a primary affirmation, page 327, and this in turn is linked with the ambiguous structure of the negation of negation. This requires a philosophy of nothingness, which is the transition from things to being, page 328. In this reflection, the ancient Greek ideas of form and arche are discarded in favor of an active existence connected more to anguish than to the eudaimonia of the Greeks or the eschatological hope of Kant. Man's questioning of the being or the origin of origin entails on Ricoeurs' argument that we can negate the principle of being not by claiming, as Plato did, that the form of the truth flows from the form of the good, but rather by insisting that knowledge does not have a categorical structure, by claiming, that is, that existence is particular, contingent, and ambiguous in its nature. On this account, every question raised potentially leads to another question. This is undoubtedly a skeptical position that, in its attempts to avoid rationalism and materialism, ends with a dualistic account. Ontology is the common root of being in the sense of the factual and of being in the sense of value. Page 326. Aristotle's conception of the philosophy of first principles is not directly reflected upon. The pre-Socratic Anaximander is the source of the view that being is primordially dialectical. Page 327. What this amounts to is not just a denial of reason and its justified conclusions, but also a denial of the categories of understanding and by implication a rejection of general and special logic. A logic that claims, for example, that the principle all men are mortal cannot be meaningfully contradicted because of its categorical and conceptual nature. History on the Kantian account is regulated by the concepts of hope and the worth and dignity of man, and by extension, his civilizations and cultures, in which his soul is writ large. The roles of the good and the true are manifested in our historical texts in a way similar to, but different from the way in which these roles are manifested in our aesthetic works, in which there is, of course, a greater role for the imagination, the psychological process of recognition, and the logic of the dialectic.